My op-ed over at HartmannReport.com is titled "Ghostbuster Bill Barr was the who you gonna call guy for 3 treasonous GOP presidents." It turns out back in the 90s, Bill Barr was referred to by William Safire, the iconic New York Times columnist, as cover-up general rather than attorney general. Bill Barr has been attorney general twice. Once he was brought in by George Herbert Walker Bush to help him cover up 2 scandals during the Reagan and Bush administrations. The first was called Iraq Gate, and it was when George H.W. Bush illegally, criminally sold weapons of mass destruction to Saddam Hussein, the same weapons of mass destruction that his son, George W. Bush, in 2003 said Saddam Hussein owning them justified our invasion of Iraq, you'll recall. So that was scandal number 1, and Safire was just going off on this thing. And then the second scandal, of course, was the Ronald Reagan campaign reaching out to the Ayatollahs in Iran who had seized American hostages, telling them, and this was a year before the election of 1980, this was in 1979, telling them that if they simply held those hostages until the election, until November of 1980, then they would be, well, actually, I guess it was very early in 1980 that the hostages were taken, because they weren't released until January 20th, which was it was a total of around 400 days. But anyhow, the Reagan campaign told the Iranians if they held those hostages until after the election, which would allow Reagan to defeat Jimmy Carter, make Jimmy Carter look weak, then Ronald Reagan and his presidency would start shipping them American-made weapons, because they had all these American-made, their entire military was American-made weaponry that we had sold them when the Shah was the leader of Iran, right up until the 1970s. And they needed spare parts, and they needed replacement missiles and things. And Reagan, throughout the 80s, was shipping that stuff to Iran, enthusiastically. And then Iran was paying him for it, and he was taking that money and using it illegally to buy weapons to send down to the Contras in Nicaragua. So those 2 scandals during the Bush administration were both, major, major scandals. And in December of 1992, now this was the week of Christmas in 1992, Bill Clinton had just been elected president the month before, in November of 92, and George Herbert Walker Bush, the president, was on his way out of office. He would be leaving office in just a couple of weeks on January 20th of 93, when Clinton would be sworn in. And he was quite concerned, George H.W. Bush, that if the true story of both Iraq Gate and Iran-Contra, but particularly Iran-Contra, if that true story came out, he was facing prison time, just like Nixon was facing prison time just 20 years earlier, or a little less than 20 years, just a decade and a half earlier. Nixon got out of going to prison by resigning office, but George Herbert Walker Bush had no intention to resign with just 4 weeks left on his presidency. So what did he do? He called in Bill Barr, his attorney general, and he said, "What do we do about this?" And Bill Barr pointed out that Lawrence Walsh, the special prosecutor, had already obtained 1 conviction, 3 guilty pleas, lots of good information from people. They were going after Caspar Weinberger, who had been the Secretary of Defense. They were going, who had overseen shipping these weapons to Iran. They were going after Caspar Weinberger, and he had testified. He had told his lawyer, who had told the media, that Weinberger was willing to fully testify in court if he was prosecuted. If they were going to send him to jail, he was going to squeal. And so, Bush was asking Bill Barr, should we just pardon Weinberger to get him to shut up? And Bill Barr said, no, pardon all of them. Pardon Brent Scowcroft, pardon all of them. And so sure enough, on Christmas Day of 1992, this giant headline across the top of the New York Times read, "Bush pardons 6 in Iran affair, averting a Weinberger trial. Prosecutor assails cover-up." And it was a cover-up. It just, it ended the investigation. This was it. George Herbert Walker Bush went on to, be thought of as a kind of moderate, modest president rather than the criminal that he was, rather than the traitor that he was. He and Reagan, in order to win the election of 1980, cut a deal with the Ayatollahs, with Iran. And this was, the president of Iran, President Bani Sadr, in 2013 told the Christian Science Monitor, and I quote, Ayatollah Khomeini and Ronald Reagan had organized a clandestine negotiation, later known as the October Surprise, which prevented the attempts by myself and then U.S. President Jimmy Carter to free the hostages before the 1980 U.S. presidential election took place. The fact that they were not released tipped the results of the election in favor of Reagan. End of quote from the president of Iran, the guy who was there when it happened. Testifying in public, essentially. So first, Bill Barr helps cover up, this whole thing with George Herbert Walker Bush and Iran-Contra. And then he helps cover up the fact that Putin basically owned Donald Trump. And we know about this. This is not a secret. Some of the stuff that has happened as a result of this is, truly, truly startling. In his first month in office, Trump outed an Israeli spy, remember that, to the Russian ambassador, resulting in Mossad having to burn this spy. And then, as a result of that, the U.S. had to pull a spy inside Russia who was, quote, according to CNN sources, the spy had access to Putin and could even provide images of documents on the Russian leader's desk. We pulled that guy out because the CIA was afraid that Trump had burned him too. And then we get this, on July 31st, Trump had another private conversation with Putin. The White House told Congress and the press that they discussed wildfires and trade among nations, right? No droids in this car. The following week, on August 2nd of 2019, the Daily Beast's Betsy Swan reported that Trump had just asked the Office of the Director of National Intelligence for a list of all its employees, including our spies and overseas intelligence officers who had worked more than 90 days. The request had intelligence officials experiencing disquiet. Within a year, the New York Times ran a story with the headline, quote, captured, killed, or compromised. CIA admits to losing dozens of informants, end quote. The CIA then alerted their own spies all around the world that apparently Donald Trump had leaked their identity to Vladimir Putin. 3 weeks after Trump groveled before Putin in Helsinki while attacking U.S. intelligence agencies from the podium, Rand Paul flew to Moscow on Trump's behalf and hand-delivered a package of classified documents to Putin, which remain undisclosed to this day. In response, John McCain, the senator from Arizona, went on the floor of the Senate and said, and I quote, the senator from Kentucky is now working for Putin. Of course, he was working for Trump, who was working for Putin. But with Bill Barr now in charge of the Justice Department, on top of this, at this time, you had Charles McConnell, who was running the counterintelligence operation for the FBI out of the New York field office. He was the guy all these stories of Trump colluding with Russia were going to, and it turns out now that he ended up working for Oleg Deripaska, this billionaire oligarch who was in tight with Putin. And not only was he working for Deripaska, Paul Manafort, who was running Trump's campaign in 2016, had received over $24 million from Oleg Deripaska, according to media reports, and was working for Deripaska. So here you've got a Putin agent, Paul Manafort, running Trump's campaign, Trump being a Putin agent, passing classified information along to Russia, which results in the burning of at least one Israeli spy that we know of, the burning of at least one major U.S. spy inside the Kremlin, and possibly the death of dozens of CIA officers and agents around the world. And who covered it all up? Bill Barr. It's an amazing story. You can read it all. It's posted over at HartmannReport.com. I also posted it this morning at dailycoast.com.